tardes. Good afternoon, everyone. Can y'all hear us? All right. Again, buenas tardes. My name is Rosa Isela Cervantes. I'm the director of El Centro de la Raza, and I'm here with one of my colleagues.
Buenas tardes, everyone. My name is Alejandro Mendia Rivera.
So we're really excited to be here to share with you a little bit about serving and working with undocumented students. A lot of our examples are at UNM, but we try to also make it as broad as possible. But we're also open to any questions you all may have. And if we don't know the answer collectively, we can find one, is my thought on that.
So we're going to start by going over a little bit of terminology, and I do say a little bit, right, because there's so much terminology around immigration and immigration statuses, but these are some of the terms that we run into the most often that people have questions about, right? So undocumented just means that you're here in the United States and you don't currently have a visa or residency or citizenship or any of that type of documentation, right? You might be in the process, you might have a action, but you don't currently hold a visa or permanent residency or citizenship. DACA, that is not such a popular term anymore. Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals was a program that was started under the Obama administration in 2012 that gave immigrants who were brought here undocumented a pathway to earning a work permit, but not a pathway to legal permanent residency or citizenship. I do say that that's not as popular anymore because under the previous Trump administration, there were several legal challenges to it, and it is currently on pause for new applicants. We do have folks who have it from when they had it before the Trump administration that can continue to renew it, but a lot of our students in college, and certainly for those of you in high schools, they will not qualify for this at this moment. Mixed status family, right, that's families who have a child who could be a citizen, another one could be undocumented, the parents, one of them could be a resident, one of them could be a citizen, right? So basically having mixed immigration statuses within the family. Legal permanent resident, right, more commonly referred to as you have a green card, right? Legal permanent residents most often will have a path to citizenship and are working on that. And then the next three, immigration and customs enforcement, they do internal enforcement away from the border. CBP, they're around the border, right? If you go to like places, that checkpoint, that's before Las Cruces, or right at the border, that's CBP. And then USCIS, Citizenship and Immigration Services, they process applications, right? They're paper pushers, and collectively we can call them Navidad. And then New Mexico Senate Bill 582, we have a slide on that later, but it is a very important law here in New Mexico. And then I-10, I-10 is a 9-digit number that is not as magical as a social security, but is still pretty magical. It allows our undocumented students to be able to run through background checks, to establish credit, and to be able to do a couple of other things like pay contractors. It's not the same as a social security number. It cannot go in the FAFSA, and it does not give them authorization to work. Being a contractor and being an employee are two very different things.
So we want to talk a little bit about who are our undocumented students and just some of the terminology that Alejandro talked about, kind of extending even our language capacities, if you will. But really thinking about this term of illegal aliens versus undocumented, it's really about a humanistic perspective and really being able to say that honestly a person can't be illegal in and of themselves. They may commit acts and crimes, right, which is completely different. Think about our students who have been brought when they were 2, 5, they didn't know what was happening. And often we have students that find out that they're undocumented when they're applying for college. And that's one of the hardest things for a student to find out and recognize that they don't have the same rights and privileges that their friends do. So really your language is super important. I think it's important to understand who are our undocumented students, right? They are high school graduates. Many now are college graduates. I know many who are now PhD holders. And so thinking about our students, they're not criminals. and really thinking about how many there are across our high schools and then in higher education, right? So it's estimated that right now we have about 408,000 students in colleges and universities across the United States. Honestly, they're just students and regular citizens wanting to do right by their families, themselves, and society in general, and want to live a good life. Again, some didn't have a choice to be undocumented, and it's really important to just think about how diverse our undocumented students are. Many people, because we're in New Mexico, will say, oh, all our undocumented students are from Mexico. Well, that's not the case. Maybe some border states with Mexico and the US, that might be true for larger populations, but we have students of all backgrounds and nationalities who are undocumented. And so often people in communities will send students to us, and they'll be like, I don't know why they sent us to you, I'm not Hispanic. One, we're still gonna serve them, so you should know that. So regardless, we're still gonna serve them, and we will tell them, like, your nationality, your background doesn't matter, we're here to serve. But it's also important because then you pigeonhole and put everybody into one box, and we don't fit in boxes. And then, they're really part of our campus community. Some of our most active and engaged students are undocumented. And I think it's also important to know, people are like, well, they have all of these benefits in K through 12. K through 12 is a guaranteed right for anybody. Higher ed is not, and this is where the changes happen, okay? So it's just super important to remember these nuances.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about Senate Bill 582, right? Serving undocumented students is not just something that we should do, it's the law. In New Mexico, higher education institutions are forbidden from denying students based on their documentation status. So let's say little Alejandro applies to UNM and his GPA is a 4.0 and he's undocumented. My GPA was not a 4.0, by the way. And he's undocumented. UNM cannot say, well, you're a great student, but you're undocumented, so goodbye. However, if little Alejandro is, has a 1.5 GPA and is undocumented, UNM can say, I'm sorry, but because of your GPA, we cannot admit you at this time. My GPA wasn't a 1.5, it was not. And so New Mexico Senate Bill 582 follows in the footsteps of some great progressive champions like Texas and Kansas. I know, right? Kind of weird. But how times have changed. So it does go a step further in saying that students who graduated from a New Mexico high school, who had been here in secondary school for at least a year, and then graduated or got their GED, also can access state financial aid. And so, I want to say that I'm here presenting not just because I'm a subject expert because of my work, I'm also a subject expert because of my lived experience. I was undocumented throughout the majority of my life. I graduated from high school and from college while still being undocumented. I graduated in May 2012. DACA was announced in July of 2012, so I became a DACA recipient later that year. And then I became a legal permanent resident in 2017, and I recently became a citizen. So I've been through the U.S. Immigration system over the course of 25 or so years. And so what Senate Bill 582 allowed me to do was to apply for the lottery, to qualify for the lottery rather, right? It lets our students now qualify for the Opportunity Scholarship as well. And so this is a really, really important law. It has been around for a long time. I wish Stephanie Rodriguez was still here because one of the downsides to the law is that there are no enforcement mechanisms in it, right? And so there are unfortunately higher ed institutions who choose kind of to like look the other way. And then there are some really, really progressive champions in our state, like Santa Fe Community College and the University of New Mexico, who take the law to its fullest extent and say, yeah, we have state funds, right, SSIG, that we can then offer through different avenues to our undocumented students, because we know that they don't qualify for federal aid.
State work center, if they're without qualification. Yes.
Right, if they're a DACA recipient, they also are qualified for state work studies, so lots of good things. And so he said we don't have an enforcement to the law, but really each of you in this room can be the person who enforces that law and can really put it into action at your institutions. So the difference between FAFSA and state aid, right? You heard about some of the challenges and some of the things you have to do in order to apply, right? Again, for FAFSA, federal support, right? You have to be a U.S. citizen, legal permanent resident, or some sort of eligible non-citizen, right? It does qualify you for Pell Grant loans and work study, and then for us, we talk a lot about UNM, so we tell students about the UNM priority date, or remind folks, you might have the same at some of the higher ed institutions that you work with, so make sure you're aware of those. Now, does it disqualify a student? No, but this is the way to get the maximum aid possible by meeting some of those timelines, right? So, and then on the side, right, for undocumented students thinking about UNM state aid, at UNM we have a UNM state aid form. So students fill that out in lieu of the FAFSA. That way there's no confusion between, oh, I'm going to fill out the FAFSA, but I'm going to do a paper FAFSA, or I'm going to do a one without the social security number. So it doesn't confuse students, and it also helps with parents who may be scared to help their student do something like a federal FAFSA, right? And so it's definitely important to think about that. Again, this is the eligibility of the student, not the parents. And also just thinking about, again, all the same things we've talked about.
Something that I really want to mention, thank you Rosa for saying, right, that we are the greatest enforcement mechanism for Senate Bill 582. I want to say that UNM didn't just wake up one day, like top leadership, and say, yeah, we should really be more undocumented friendly and stop using the printed version of the FAFSA. Right, it took individuals like ourselves and like our very own Victoria Padilla here to be like, we have to be more proactive about finding solutions that are accessible to our students. And so I really encourage all of you to also be those agents of change at your institutions. Which is a great segue to our next slide. Raise your hand if you consider yourself a gatekeeper. A few of you hesitantly, apprehensively, maybe. Yes, for those of you that kind of did not raise your hand or did not raise your hand, I hate to break it to you, but we are all gatekeepers, right? By definition, we have knowledge that our students, especially our first generation and students from underserved backgrounds, do not have, right? We hold the key for them to be able to take those next steps in their education. And we can act as bad gatekeepers and not provide that information, or we can be good gatekeepers and give them that information. But best of all, we can be allies and really help change the system, like I mentioned, right, like Victoria, in creating policies and procedures that are easier for our students to flow through. And so I'll give you a great example. When I was an undergrad, as I mentioned, I was undocumented, and there's a fellowship at the Central that allowed me to apply without having a social and receive a scholarship, not paying it because I couldn't work, I didn't have social. It required an unofficial transcript, so I walked over to the registrar's office, and you can still do that. Yeah, that's all I am. And the parchment was not a thing for sure. And the person at the front desk was like, oh, can I have your social security number? Which, by the way, by then I'm not old enough to where UNM IDs were not a thing. Like, I had a UNM ID. And she was like, well, I need your social security number. And I was like, well, I don't have one. And she was like, oh no, honey, just call your mom, she knows it. And I'm like, no, I don't have the social security number, I'm undocumented. And she goes, oh, you're undocumented, well then you shouldn't be here. And so I went back, almost in tears to the previous director of El Centro, and I was like, Vero, I'm not gonna be able to apply for the fellowship because I can't get my transcript because I don't have a social. And she goes, what? And I was like, yeah, well, the person there told me that if I don't have a social, I can't get my transcript and that I actually shouldn't be here. Well, if any of you knew Veronica Mendez Cruz, you knew she was not going to just sit there and take that. And so, she was a strong ally, and she advocated for staff to be trained in serving all students, And two, right, to really change these systems, right, we implemented the UNM banner ID to move away from social security numbers, and so it was an outdated practice how we still needed that. And so that's a great example of how you all can be allies, right? Be like Reno, like Rosa, like Victoria, and try to implement these changes, right? I don't think it's enough to be able to tell our students, like, hey, if you're undocumented, yes, you can go, right? That's not enough. We can go beyond that and really be allies and find resources for them and find solutions to some of their problems.
All right, so the big question often folks is to ask us is, well, you told us all this, what can we do? And so there's some very simple things that you can do and that you have control over. In addition to advocating for like large system shifts, right? Just the things that you do with your personal space in your office, etc. So one, first educate yourselves, right, on all the resources available for undocumented students. This morning, I'm sitting in the audience and, I'm looking at all the links and I'm like, what does it say in FAFSA about undocumented students? So I went down the rabbit hole of looking for all of those things. So do those kinds of searches on occasion and really try to stay up to date with what information is where. And I know it can be vast. And often you have to talk with colleagues and try to kind of root out what's real and what's not. And so, but really do that type of work so that you stay definitely at the forefront of knowledge so that you can pass it on. Often, if you don't have the answer to a question, that you've connected with colleagues that you can do a warm handoff, right? So it's much better when I then send a student and I'm like, hey, I'm gonna send you to go talk to Eddie at the financial aid office. And then I call Eddie and I'm like, hey Eddie, I'm sending a student and this is kind of the issues and the questions they might have but might not feel comfortable sharing. And when you do that kind of warm handoff, it's so much more valuable for students and it helps them feel at ease with the person you're sending them to. And then they're more open about really all of the things happening, right? That they need assistance. So make yourself visible as an ally. If you walk into my office or Alejandro's, even the front doors of El Centro, you're going to see LGBTQ pride flags. You're going to see some Dream Zone training. We're going to see posters and flyers that have different imagery. For example, butterflies are very iconic for immigration. Monarch butterflies in particular, so you'll see some of that on some of our imagery. And it's really about setting up the space. Even your bulletin boards, something as simple as putting up a butterfly makes a big difference, right? Folks are looking for what kinds of things do folks have in their office because that tells us who they are, right? And so it's important to think about that. And then oftentimes when undocumented students, when they get to the point where they come out to you, if you will, it's because they've gotten to a point where they trust you or they're so desperate to find some help that they're just going to say it and kind of just hold their breath and hope that they've come out to a good person, right? And so regardless of your stance, please don't be that registrar person that was like, you don't belong here. Say, you know what, I'm not sure I'm the right person, but let's connect you to somebody, right? Respect their privacy. And really think about everything that you do, every phone call you make, every letter that you write, every instance and interaction to be student-friendly and centered. But at the end of the day, remembering that we're all human, right? So being kind to one another, treating people with respect, all of those things, it goes a long way.
So working to remove systemic barriers, right, I mentioned, especially at colleges and universities, right, we have so much bureaucracy, and some of those policies can sometimes be exclusive without a purpose. And so working to advocate to change those, whether it's at high schools or at higher ed institutions, right, if you're a high school counselor and you see your students running up against this one problem at UNM or at CNM or wherever, right, contact your partners and be like, hey, why does UNM do this? Like, do we really need to do this, or how can we make it easier? How can we better explain to our students how to navigate this barrier? Creating funding opportunities for undocumented students, right, with institutional, state, and grant opportunities. As we mentioned at UNM, SFCC, and several other schools, right, we grant different pockets of need-based financial aid in addition to state funds like lottery and opportunity scholarships. I recognize that can be really difficult to make happen sometimes, right? At high schools, I would say, just reach out to us and ask us for materials that you can provide your students with so that they know what's available to them when they're going to college or if they're looking to go to college. Creating similar programming experiences that don't require a social security number, right? So also being informed about internships, fellowships, like what I participated with at Centro, right? For those of you that don't know a lot about it, Centro, we run several co-curricular programs. I myself oversee an undergraduate research program. We have a freshman and sophomore mentorship program. We have a program for graduate and professional students to be able to navigate their master's or doctoral programs. All of these come with scholarships that do not have a requirement for any type of immigration status. So our international students, our undocumented students, they can all apply and receive funding by being a part of these programs. And then lastly, understand limitations, right, that undocumented students have. And so, I remember I went to La Cueva, by the way. Unfortunately, Deborah was not there yet. But fortunately, there were some really great allies. So I was a DECA nerd. And Mr. Faulkner was like, hey, we're going to Orlando. You made it to nationals. That's how big of a DECA nerd I was. And I was like, Mr. Faulkner, I'm undocumented. I don't know if I can apply. I don't even have a driver's license. And luckily he was an ally, and he was like, well, I don't want to get you in trouble, but we'll see what we can do. And he did some digging around, and because I was still a minor, I was 17. All I had to do was show my Cueva ID, and that was enough back then. And another great example is in my English class. It was a requirement that we applied to UNM as just part of like our classwork. And at that time, it was a paper application, and it had 9 boxes, and it said social security number, and I was like, oh. And so I asked my teacher, and she was like, I'm not sure what you do in your case. Why don't you go speak to your counselor? Shockingly, back then at La Cueva, there had never been an undocumented student before. I say shockingly, like sarcastically, because back then La Cueva there were not a lot of minority students. But luckily, my counselor was a big ally, and she was like, I've never had an undocumented student before, but let me call my colleagues and see what we can do for you. She's like, I'm sure we can do something. And so she was the one that informed me, at that time you just left it blank. Little did I know the people at the registrar's office here at UNM at that time were Central alum and big advocates of undocumented students. And so, I was able to get my application to UNM, and that's where I started as a freshman. But it took a team, right? It takes a village, and it took really high school teachers and high school counselors to help me feel like I belong, right? Despite not having that social, despite not having those immigration credentials, that I still belong, that I was still a part of the DECA team, and that I could still compete for the Cueva, and that I could still pursue my academic goals and come to UNM.
One more thing I want to mention is often folks will tell me, well, what's the point of an undocumented student to go to higher ed and get a degree? Because they can't get a job anyways, right? I get that question a lot. And my response to folks, especially if they're in higher ed with me, I'm like, our job isn't to worry about what happens next. It's to give them the best quality education and experience while they're here. And that applies whether it's in K-12 or in higher ed, right? The next, anything can happen, right? We don't know. Just like Alejandro, right? His story, we have so many other students who things and circumstances and laws change, but what shouldn't change is what we provide and the quality of work, the quality of education that we provide to all students. And so thinking about also just creating a similar programming, often folks are like, well, what do you mean by that? That's just thinking through the process. So recently we presented with the College of Nursing, for example, and one of the things they offer their students is externships. Well, an externship is actually like a job. You have to apply, you get paid a paycheck, you put in hours, that sort of thing. So we talked with them about, well, how do you create an externship where students aren't paid, but they're getting the same type of experience? What kind of an internship or research opportunity can you offer that's maybe funded through a grant or through something that's not federally prohibitive? but still allows them to get and gain that same experience. And so it's just thinking about those little things that are super important. And with that, we'll leave you with our contact information, and we'll ask for questions at the end. Thank you all.
Thank you.